For years, much has been reported about the stereotypes and cultural barriers that divide African Americans and Arab Americans. Next month, a unique dialogue will take place between Black and Arab women at the Charles H. Wright Museum of African American History. The event is hosted by the Inkster Alumnae chapter of Delta Sigma Theta and the Arab Community Center for Social Services, better known as Access. Here to talk about the event are two of its organizers, Soraya Farver, who is president of the Inkster Alumnae chapter of the Deltas, and Rana Elmir is the deputy director of the ACLU of Michigan and facilitator for the dialogue. Welcome to American Black Journal. This is a fascinating topic, and it's something that I think people talk about privately a lot, but we don't ever sort of put it out front for people to be able to talk about together and try to maybe come to some understanding. What's the inspiration behind doing this now? Well,
in Delta Sigma Theta, one of our thrusts is international awareness and involvement, and so we want to build a greater sensitivity and build our diversity, understanding, the different cultural differences, and it's just important for us to do that. And each year we try to include in our programming, those types of projects so that we broaden our horizons.
Right.
We've also had a previous dialogue before that was held at the Arab American Museum in Dearborn, and that was a very fascinating event as well.
Yeah.
We learned a lot about each other.
Yeah.
And so, we have to start off with our similarities so that we can branch out into our differences and try to understand those.
Right. So if you're putting together a dialogue about this issue, where do you start? Where do you start with who are the people involved, and where do you start with how do you talk about this?
Yeah. What's really interesting about this is the first dialogue was 12 years ago, and it just happened to be right after 9/11.
Okay.
It wasn't planned that way. It just happened to be that way. And so that dialogue took a different tone, a different spirit than the one that I was a part of last year, which was very much about our similarities and starting to talk about our differences and issues and stereotypes within the communities. And so last year's dialogue, there was a commitment to begin to make this an annual event, and I think that's where so much work happens. When it is an annual event, when there is a commitment to not just bring together women who don't know each other and may not know much about each other, but when we begin to make friendships and we become women who trust each other, know each other, and are able to have those frank discussions. And so for my part as a facilitator, I go wherever they take me. I am not guiding the conversation. I want to hear what they have to say in terms of the tensions, in terms of the misconceptions, in terms of the stereotypes, and in terms of the pain.
Right. So let's talk about what some of those are. What are some of these barriers that exist between these two communities, and how does that play out in Metro Detroit?
Well, I think we tend to allow our stereotypes to navigate our behaviors, and so even with the last discussion, and just trying to understand like people build up those misconceptions.
Sure.
The interactions that we have are always pretty limited. We don't want to, just say that, okay, the Arab American community, their experiences maybe like in Dearborn or anything that have happened in the past, you build in a negative connotation. And so it's like, okay, let's try to talk beyond that. Let's work beyond that. Also, as it relates to, just how we interact in business, how we have tried to put a classification on, just this group and say, this is how they treat us, and how, it's important for us to say, okay, let's take that isolated incident and break that down and understand that that's not the norm.
It's not everybody.
It's not everybody.
Yeah.
And so, we learned that, in our last discussion, and it was amazing because, one particular instance, it was an individual who was concerned about how she had been treated. And it turned out to be that the interaction.
How an African American woman had been treated.
In the Arab American community, or just actually within the community, but just one particular individual. And so the gentleman who she had interacted with did not treat her as what she was accustomed to. But it was based on their cultural beliefs. Okay, and so once you start to understand that and say, okay, you know what, that was actually a sign of respect. Right.
And not an insult.
And not an insult. So, we are trying to translate that kind of interaction. So it's like you can understand that those differences aren't to be taken either personally or offensively.
I would imagine that because of the sort of rich cultural tapestry we have among people here in Metro Detroit, this is something you see all the time, right?
Absolutely. Isolation is the petri dish of divisiveness, of racism, of discrimination, and that's what this event is about. For me, one of the most profound moments last year was when one of the sorority members stood up and talked about how her childhood and her community was completely changed when a freeway was built right through her neighborhood. And the black-owned businesses disappeared, and you couldn't walk to your pharmacist's store anymore. And a young Arab American woman, this is something we've read about, right? But a young Arab American woman stood up and she said, I had no idea that the freeway that I drive on impacted you every single day, impacted you in this way, and essentially in your mind destroyed your community. That's a really important, that history is so important. Hatred and bigotry didn't start for Arab Americans on 9/11, and it also didn't start when Arab Americans discovered it. And so we need to learn from one another, we need to learn our histories, and build a movement together.
Right. I think one of the things that people tend to think about the Arab American community is that it's an immigrant community and therefore sort of takes on a lot of the characteristics of other immigrant communities. But now, we're 30, 40 years in some cases into Arab Americans being a big part of this community. How is that changing the way they interact with other communities, like the African American community, just being here?
Yeah, I definitely think the immigrant experience has perhaps, and the isolation of the immigrant experience in many ways impacts the interactions we have with other communities. But in also in many ways, there are organizations like Access, there are plenty of other organizations as well that are trying to break down those barriers. Access is, on the bottom of Access's logo, it says, improving, assisting, and empowering. And there's even with Access itself as an organization, there's this misconception that it only serves the Arab American community. It serves all communities. And that's one thing that, and that's in terms of Access's mission and the way that Access has handled these types of relationships, that is one way that we break down barriers as well. So this is an annual event. Tell me what's the overall goal here? I mean, what's the measuring stick you guys use to determine whether this is having an effect on these relationships?
Well, we're hoping that it builds a greater relationship for our future events, not just the dialogue, but then we have community fundraisers. We have other events that are expected to improve the economic conditions of our service area. Also, like any of our health fairs or any of our we have like a hustle night that is always well attended, and the community support of that. We end up funding other efforts with the American Heart Association, and so all of these things that are impacting women and children, it's not just limited to blacks or Arab Americans or whatever. And so it's broadening that spectrum and that reach to make sure that they can at least appreciate and understand what we're trying to do as a community service organization.
Right. One of the things that's true in this region, of course, is that we live very separately from each other and continue to do that. I know the ACLU is always working to break down those barriers. You know, are we any closer at all to that being less of an issue and less of an aggravator in these divides?
You know, I'll say that there is a proxy war happening in communities. And truth, reality, justice have no place in this proxy war.
Right.
And so when you see ICE or CBP patrolling churches and patrolling schools to find, you know, undocumented immigrants, when you see the Chapel Hill murders, when you see the murder of Eric Garner, Mike Brown, these are assaults, but they're not assaults on a single community. They are assaults on our entire community. And that is the importance of a dialogue like this. I'd like to see this grow. I'd like to see this be nurtured. And I'd like to see this expand.
Expand to other communities, right?
Other communities.
Yeah.
Bring in the men.
Right. Right. That's just to say, where are the men in this conversation?
Come on.
They have the same misconceptions as the women, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Well, great to have you guys here, and we'll look forward to your discussion.
Thank you.
You.
Yeah.